Good morning, everybody. You are listening once again to Dennis from Awakening in Health. And I have a very interesting guest with me this morning, a man we are going to call Sage. Now, the reason he doesn't want to give his real name is because he would be what I would consider a conspiracy theorist. Now, I was following his work for a number of years under his banner, The Anonymous Sage, and I managed to track him down. So I'm very excited to talk to him this morning about where he came from and why he's doing what he does. So good morning, Sage. How are you this morning?
I'm doing good, Dennis. How are you?
I'm very good. Now, just at a guess, I'm thinking that you're more in around your late 20s, early 30s. Where did you start this journey, I guess, of questioning maybe most things that the mainstream narrative are telling us?
Well, the journey started a number of years ago, I would say around the year 2016. And it was a friend of mine, a college friend, who actually planted a seed of awakening for me. And she was the one who told me that 9/11 was an inside job. And I was actually very curious about that, and I was obviously skeptical at first because, I pretty much absorbed the mainstream narrative for my entire life up until that point. But when she told me about that, I started digging and researching and investigating that event for myself. And it took a lot of hours of sort of research and introspection as well, in terms of what does this mean for myself personally in my life, if this is actually true. And slowly but surely, as I went through the evidence, I was completely shocked that the evidence showed that my friend was right, and this was exactly what occurred. And it was incredible that I missed it as it unfolded, and even in the years afterwards. It sort of just was in the back of my mind, but I never really thought about it much. But researching that really showed me that there's so much I don't know. There's so much I have no idea about that's taking place in the world. And up until now, I've had a very, naive view of things. And so one thing led to another, and I started digging further into the power structures of the world and the financial system, how the central banks operate, how the masses are essentially enslaved in a very subtle manner through a variety of different mechanisms and deception that is taking place, fraud that has been normalized and is extremely widespread. And interestingly enough, I found myself to be very alone after this in terms of my views and what I knew at that point. Everyone else was kind of happily asleep or sleepwalking through life, just doing, the typical things you expect or that society expects you to do. And that was a bit jarring and a bit baffling as well, because I was wondering to myself, why aren't more people questioning these things? Why are people just going about their daily lives as if everything is perfectly normal? And then, obviously, a few years after that, you had the pandemic, which struck in 2020, and so that kind of was unexpected, and it, totally changed the trajectory of everything that's taking place right now. And I would say after that, it just kind of my entire range of interests exploded, and I started digging into virology and the medical sciences, and I was shocked to realize, things about that which were also untrue and which were not exactly what we were told.
Okay, I'll stop you there for one sec. So for a lot of people who might be listening to my show here, they might be very challenged to consider that the story that they were told about 9/11 is an incorrect one. We've got video evidence. We can see planes hitting these buildings. We have agencies like the CIA, the FBI, who have done massive loads of digging. We've got people on cameras that are validating all of this story that we're told. What what can you say that might make people have a second think about all that particular narrative before we move on to what's going on now?
Well, after a certain point, the number of coincidences just pile up and becomes, a mountain, and it's something that you can't ignore. After a certain point, once you see enough of those coincidences and enough of those anomalies and those sort of inconsistencies in the official reporting and between what actually happened on the ground, it would be an insult to one's intelligence, an insult to one's soul to deny what the evidence or where the evidence leads you. So one of the things that really struck me was just watching the buildings in slow motion, and I really watched it several times, to really see at 2 times slower the speed, 4 times slower the speed, because this was when I was first absorbing this. I was like, did this really happen? And my eyes confirmed that, that this is what it's showing me, that there is clearly an explosion happening at every level of the building. There's no way that a single plane can, do that type of damage to a building that is that structurally sound and is actually able to withstand an impact of 10 of those planes or more while still standing. So a lot of those things with physics and structurally, the engineering of the building, you have to really intuitively think about what it really means and whether the official narrative really stands up to scrutiny, and it doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all.
And I believe that
I would say that's one thing, is just watching it in slow motion. That's something you have to do.
So actually taking a look at something and believing your own eyes. And I think you've referenced things like the architects for 9/11, is that right? Where you have more than 2,000 or 3,000 architects at this stage who are fully qualified, who are saying that the physics of a building collapsing in its own footprint are impossible. It has to be, it just can't happen in relation from a top-down explosion. Would that be, am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I think you're referencing the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Yeah.
It's the AE 9/11 group. So I also dug into a lot of their work, and they reported on, for example, the NIST report. The U.S. government released an NIST report following the blasts, in which they basically indicated that there was no foul play involved, and it was just this elaborate, several hundred pages long document filled with a bunch of fluff, making up their own physics on the fly. And I remember they made up something like the crunch pull theory, or maybe it was called the push-pull theory, to describe how the building could possibly collapse into its own footprint like that. But you can tell it's just total nonsense. So that reporting definitely dismantles that entire narrative set forth by the government and the NIST. So I would say the AE 9/11 group laid a lot of groundwork there in terms of structurally demonstrating that this wasn't possible unless you had these buildings, laced with explosives.
And I think I've seen in some of your other little posts the numerous flashes at different levels when you look in slow motion, almost like a sequence of very controlled explosions before the building itself collapsed. Is that right?
Exactly, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about watching it in slow motion. You can see exactly what you're talking about happening level by level by level.
Okay.
And so I encourage people to watch it, just the blasts themselves at maybe like 5 times slower the speed, and see for yourself what's actually taking place at each level of that building. And you can see the plumes of smoke, which are like exploding and shooting outwards. And you can also see pillars of steel and literally from the building itself just completely exploding outwards and being thrust outwards as if there was a blast there at each level. So it's undeniable when you look at it in slow motion.
And then onto that, I've certainly seen you forward a few posts around the massive amounts of money that were made when those buildings were destroyed in relation to new owners, reinsuring those buildings specifically for terrorism. Is that right?
Yeah, Larry Silverstein was the one who essentially enacted that insurance plan. In the case of a quote-unquote terrorist attack, there would be an insurance payout for whoever owned those buildings. And I believe he bought the buildings, shortly before the attack, which was quite the coincidence. But that one was pretty obvious in terms of him being a co-conspirator and just another one of the people involved in the entire operation.
Very quickly, can you also mention there was a report, I think, was it by Rumsfeld the day before, and the significance of Building 7?
Yeah, the significance of Building 7 is that Building 7 fell without any impact from any plane or anything hitting it. And so when you look at the way Building 7 falls, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, of like a standard building that somebody might try to demolish, an old building or old structure. It looked like that was taking place. It didn't look like there was any sort of collapse from fires. There was only like a few fires on a couple different floors, and it was very light. Certainly not enough to inflict that kind of damage. So a lot of people don't know about Building 7, that it was the third building that fell, and that's kind of the smoking gun that tells you that something is fishy about the official narrative. Donald Rumsfeld, he did release a report about missing money in the Pentagon, and I think the 9/11 situation helped to cover that entire thing up as being a false flag, distraction, to divert people's attention from missing taxpayers' money, essentially.
And this sum of money was massive. It was how much was it again? Way up there in the billions. And from memory, again, I think maybe in relation to some of the work that I saw you put forward was that the records for those transactions, for what happened to that lost money, were actually stored in Building 7 as well. Is that right?
Yes, reportedly the records that documented those transactions were stored in Building 7, as well as some other critical documentation implicating the government in various crimes. And it was just a convenient way for them to destroy the evidence and kind of kill two birds with one stone.
Okay, so I think really what you're saying is that with all these little parts all fitting together, just maybe one on their own, we could make an excuse or an exception, but when we're putting something else into the mix and something else into the mix, the set of coincidences is just too profound for anybody not to at least have some sort of suspicion and to believe the mainstream narrative. And then of course we've seen that we're expected to believe that a passport from one of the bombers ended up falling out of the airplane and being found 2 or 3 miles away or something like that. Is that right?
Oh yeah, I was just about to mention that.
Yeah.
Supposedly an FBI agent who was walking by found this completely intact passport on the ground from one of the hijackers, and it was totally clean, totally intact, not torn or burnt at all, and that's just unbelievable because you clearly saw on TV the plane blowing up as it impacted the building. So how do you expect a passport to somehow fall out of that and be recovered on the ground?
Yep, quite astonishing, really. Welcome back to Awakening in Health, and you are listening to Dennis O'Connor this morning. I'm talking to a young man in America who does not want to disclose his whereabouts or his full identity even, because he would be what we might call a conspiracy theorist. And we've just gone over some stuff about 9/11, and if people review the earlier part of that conversation, I think to not be at least a small bit suspicious about the narrative that we're being given about that, really we have to maybe think a bit more seriously about what we're hearing from the authorities about that situation. Many things just quite simply don't seem to add up. Sage, what is the next, I guess, rabbit hole that you went down in relation to thinking that we're not being given the full truth by the authorities about a number of different things?
Yeah, I would say the next rabbit hole I went down was probably the financial system in terms of the central banking fraud and how they use, fractional reserve banking to essentially duplicate people's money and re-lend it out on interest, and basically pocketing money from creating money out of thin air. And so that was pretty huge and pretty devastating in terms of, seeing it in all aspects of society, the ripple effects of that.
Could you,
And
can you elaborate on that slightly? So, what does it mean by creating money out of thin air? That sounds like a fairly far out idea to be putting out there for the normal person who has borrowed money from for a car or is in the grip of paying off mortgages, especially these days when we have interest rates going higher and higher and people are sacrificing even food in order to have a house over their heads. That's a fairly serious one.
yeah, so a good analogy to think of it is if you think back to the olden times or ancient times when people would store their gold in, very primitive bank that they had back then. So what would happen is that these people they wouldn't really come back to get their money in a long time. They would keep it there maybe for many months or years at a time. And the bankers, the ones who were holding their money in the safe or in the storage compartment, they realized this. They realized that this money is just sitting here for long periods of time and it's not doing anything. Why don't we, why don't we use this money to make ourselves rich? Why don't we re-lend this money out, reloan this money out, this gold, and charge people interest on it and make money, while we sleep? Because these people aren't going to come back for their money in a long time. They're just keeping it with us as a storehouse. And so that's a simplified analogy, but that kind of, in a nutshell, describes the fraud that's taking place with the current banking system.
And
And
from
they're doing the exact same thing as they did with the gold back in, you know, the olden times,
and
but
from and
now
from
they're just doing it with fiat currency, with US dollars, etc.
and from my understanding, if I were to borrow $100,000, then I use that for whatever I want. But if I were to deposit that $100,000 in another bank, then that other bank would lend out $90,000 of that. And if that other person took that $90,000 and deposited in another bank, the next bank again would lend out $80,000 of that. And this is where the fraction comes in, isn't it? And every
Mm.
single commitment for those loan repayments is all based off that original borrowing which I had. So, would am I explaining that in a way that you agree with?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
So
That's
quite
basically
rightly,
what.
then we're as you said, it is money being made out of thin air. And when you say about the banking system, could you? It's something that I've chatted about on my shows a little bit as well. Could you? We have this idea that the government and the reserve banks and whatnot, they're doing their best to help us. They're trying to balance the books. They're trying to keep a lid on things. What would you agree with that or not?
I wouldn't agree with that at all. That's just a cover story. And I've had conversations with friends about this and about the Federal Reserve coming up in conversation, and they talk about, how they think that the Federal Reserve is needed to manage the economy. So they actually think there needs to be some centralized institution or authority that controls the financial system and the currency essentially, and they don't realize what a slippery slope that is, because you're giving a private bank with private shareholders the ability to control the money supply of the country. And I think it was Rothschild who once said back in the 1600s or something that um, I care not who makes a nation's laws as long as I control the money supply of that country.
And could you elaborate
And that's basically,
what you mean by a private bank? Because I think that's a really important nuance that a lot of people miss.
yeah, a private bank is basically not beholden to anyone else except the owners and those invested in the bank. So they have no vested interest in doing anything to help the general population.
So the Federal
Um,
Reserve, for example, that name sounds very governmental. So we would assume that the Federal Reserve is owned or in some way controlled by the government.
it's actually the other way around. The Federal Reserve controls the government.
Okay,
And
so you're saying that specifically these private banks are lending money to the governments and then pulling all that money back with profit.
right. And so they're charging money on that fiat money that they're charging interest on that fiat money that they lend to the U.S. government, and that goes into circulation.
How rich are these entities?
These entities are probably, if I was to guess, I would say in the hundreds of trillions of dollars, maybe.
So in one
Uh,
click of a finger, they could extinguish all world poverty. They could wipe out all debt, and so really they have the capacity to correct all the world's financial problems just by pressing a button. But what seems to be happening is when the world is really almost on its knees with all uh, these economic situations that are happening now, they are not doing that. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're actually raising interest rates.
yeah, they're making it more difficult for people. And so you see homeowners in the US, for example, recent home buyers are being hit with high mortgage rates. So they're going to be locked in for a while into massive payments on a monthly basis. And the ripple effects go down to every level of society. And so you see even companies like tech companies, not getting as much funding from VCs, and a lot of funding being revoked because that same growth that was spurred by the low interest rates of the previous decade is now contracting and going in the opposite direction.
Almost sounds like a bit of a scam going on, doesn't it? A great way to hook people in to prosperity, and then when everybody's comfortable, just rip it all back with these high interest rates.
Right? They're basically pulling out the rug from underneath them and causing a lot of suffering in the process. But of course, they're the ones who keep profiting from these cycles that they create. And ultimately, it goes back to that control over the currency, the issuing of the currency. And none of the general population has any oversight on that. In fact, no president would ever dare to audit the Federal Reserve, to really take a look at its balances and its finance sheets. And if that were to happen, I think the president would be assassinated or, removed from power. And we saw that happen with JFK, who basically threatened to bypass the Federal Reserve, and look what happened to him.
So this Federal Reserve in the United States, I guess that's similar to here in Australia to our Reserve Bank, has never ever been audited. Is that categorically what you're saying?
Yeah, has never been audited, at least not in the modern era.
And this is a private company who lends money to the government, takes interest back, and nobody except for the owners of that institution know what's happening on the books. Is that what you're saying?
Mm. Yeah.
Makes
And
for sorry.
and the Federal Reserve isn't even the head of the snake. The head of the snake is the BIS, which is the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. So this is the central bank of all central banks. It essentially controls, I would say, 95% of all the circulating money in the entire world. So they control all the central banks in the other countries.
I'm very interested to if anybody is listening, especially on the radio show, has anybody actually even heard of the international banks, the Bank of International Settlements? Is that right?
Yeah.
And my guess is even some bank managers probably don't have a clue about this. Okay, so I'm going to steer it more towards current issues soon. But what are you trying to achieve by getting this information out there? What's your vested interest in this? Why are you so passionate about even putting your reputation on the line to talk about things that most people would think that you're a little bit crazy?
Well, I think great change is taking place in the world, and we are witnessing a wave of awakening happening right now. And it may not be very obvious on the surface, but you can sort of sense it on a deeper level. And I think this is the time to do something like this to contribute to this growing elevation in the collective consciousness. And every little bit helps. And I think if I can be one of the pieces of the puzzle that can, help pave the way for others, then that would be very beneficial to many people. So right now, I think society has gotten to the level which is quite shocking in terms of just, you know, what is accepted by the masses and what kind of goes unnoticed. And I think that is really something that is reaching a breaking point. And it goes way beyond just, the conspiracies or whatever the government is planning and things of that nature. It goes down to the intricate levels of society.
Yeah.
Are we really doing the right thing in terms of the institutions and the systems that we've set up? Kids are sitting in a classroom for 8 hours a day for 12 years of their lives. Is that really a smart thing to do? And it kind of stems from there, all the other societal issues that you see.
So you're saying that you feel compelled, even on a spiritual level, to, once you see some of these problems in society, do you feel compelled to actually try to help others to move forward in a I guess, a more human fashion?
That's correct.
Okay. All of a sudden, it almost seems like, for I guess the general listener listening in, that we've started off almost with hey, Sage, you're the crazy conspiracy guy, to somebody who's actually highlighting real issues. Even if you're off the mark with these issues, somebody has to be looking at that other side of the argument, and not just saying, hey, that's not right, but saying, hey, if there is some merit in some of the things that you're talking about, we need to be looking into this. So even to have that counter-narrative voice against the normal narrative, I think personally is really important. Let's break it now into another direction. What the world, we were promised 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we'd have this utopian society. Everybody was going to be healthy. There was going to be world peace. We're going to have abundance, own everything outright, all these kind of things. And compared to the story given to me when I was in school, I'm seeing a world that's far different from that. I'm seeing other wars happening. I'm seeing these threats of health catastrophes. We're seeing died suddenly. As we talked about the financial situation, interest rate rises. What is going on, and why has it all gone so wrong so quickly? Is it accidental?
It's definitely not accidental. Again, it goes back to the coincidences. You notice with something like 9/11. Now, in the present day, you see the coincidences just piling up, even bigger than that, because there's false flag after false flag, or psyop after psyop taking place, and it's just one thing after another. And it sort of seems to be accelerating right now.
Okay. You said it's not a coincidence. And again, because I followed your work for a little while, I have an idea of where you're going with this. I guess to use that word, you would be suggesting there is a conspiracy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So how deep does this go?
It goes extremely deep. It goes deeper than even I can imagine.
Could you elaborate?
Obviously, you want to stick to a level that people can understand, and so eventually it gets far out into the esoteric and the occult and things of that nature. But that's way over most people's heads. That's getting into mysticism and metaphysics and spirituality. But for now, you can just proceed with sort of a layman's view of that, or if you have a spiritual minded mindset, then that would be good. But the main thing is to just realize that what you see happening around you in the world is very much orchestrated and engineered in terms of the material world events that are unfolding and taking place. Obviously, the COVID pandemic is, the foremost example of that in recent years. And if you want to talk about, if you think I'm crazy for questioning that, then I would say to you, uh, why did the Rockefeller Foundation release a document called Lockstep in 2010, which is, which was 10 years prior to the declaration of that pandemic, basically laying out their plans and proposals for executing a pandemic. And they certainly have a vested interest in doing that, being that they're the Rockefeller Foundation, a massive elitist organization with, basically one of the power structures of controlling this world from behind the scenes. And I would also say to you, why did the 2012 Olympics literally showcase, in their extravagant opening ceremony, why did they showcase basically what took place during the pandemic with their people dressed up as, patients on hospital beds and, ghoulish doctors and witches and things of that nature, and showcasing a viral pandemic and a viral infection taking place. That seems really creepy and eerie to me. And why would they put something like that in the Olympic ceremony? So I encourage people to go back and watch that again, the 2012 Olympics, and see what I'm talking about. And another coincidence, if you want to add to that list, is Event 201, which took place directly before the pandemic in 2019, which was a joint effort by the Johns Hopkins Research Center and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where they literally did a tabletop exercise simulating a viral pandemic and a viral outbreak, and simulating all the various scenarios that they would have to attack in terms of getting that pandemic under control. How do we get people to take the vaccine? How do we control the information disseminated on the media? How do we control the spread of quote unquote misinformation on social media, online? So tackling all these different strategies. And then, 3 months later or several months later, you see the WHO declaring a pandemic of concern, and that basically being the spark that triggered the entire thing. So just in the context of COVID, those are some things that I would look at, but obviously it's much bigger than that and extends into many other things as well.
Welcome back. You are listening to Dennis from Awakening in Health, and I'm talking to Sage all the way from America, and you're listening to me here in the top of Australia, the tropical North Queensland. We've covered a broad range of topics which are very conspiratorial in nature. Sage has been on a crusade for the last few years to bring to the attention of the public lots of, I guess, discrepancies in the narrative that we're being told from authorities and between what seems to be happening in reality. And we just left off before the break about these signals, I guess, or these warnings that seem to happen before these big major events. And could it be coincidental? Yeah, it could. So Sage was mentioning the 2012 Olympic ceremony, where it was almost like a dress rehearsal in that opening ceremony for the events that happened with COVID, which are quite profound. And he and myself, I've seen that ceremony, would recommend anybody to have a quick look at that, the 2012 Olympics opening ceremony. And we just left off where he was describing this, I guess, a tabletop kind of meeting, which was preempting what it would be like if a pandemic happened. And this was just before COVID. And it seemed to spell out exactly what we did see happening. It was an enactment, I guess, for want of a better word, that was filmed. And again, people can look at that. What are you saying here, Sage? Are you saying that, on the other side of that argument, we have these people, they know about they know about pandemics, they know how viruses work, they know how they spread, they've identified where they come from, they've identified the shape, size. We to this stage, because of our incredible knowledge, our incredible research, have enough information to be able to work out fairly accurately what could happen in a pandemic. Okay, so these highly professional people with unlimited funds, for them to get it right doesn't sound like a stretch of imagination at all, does it?
Well, so the average person might think that, but when you dig into it, a whole different story emerges. So if you want to talk about viruses, um, you know, viruses are something that is highly dubious as far as my investigations have showed. And, people are subconsciously used to the idea now of vaccines because they've been doing it their whole life and it's been ingrained in them for many decades. But you have to check the fundamental science behind that and see if it's actually valid. And shockingly, the Lancet, which is a major publication journal, they actually released an article a number of years ago admitting that most academic research might be false. I don't remember the exact percentage. It may have, but I think they admitted that at least half is like false or highly questionable.
There was
Now
a Stanford
that's what they're publicly admitting.
there was a Stanford professor Ioannidis, who published a paper a while before that was very clear and gave many reasons for the idea that anything upwards of 90% of all academic public research was false. So that one from the Lancet doesn't surprise me at all. Sorry to cut across you there, Sage.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was going to mention that as well, so I'm glad you brought that up. That was the one that mentioned that 90%, up to 90% is false. And that's definitely a very shocking admission. But if that's what they're admitting publicly, you can only imagine it might even be worse than that. So, and I actually decided to kind of dig into this myself and read some academic papers from various other medical science disciplines. And I definitely started to notice a pervasive pattern emerging in terms of the way that research was being conducted and the true nature of things.
It's interesting the way it's been put on us recently, and I saw a comedian doing a skit on it, that we're also sold the line of leave it to the experts, and who are you to, let's say, do your own research? And as this comedian pointed out, when I had a bit of a laugh about it, that used to be called reading. Now this idea that we can look at stuff ourselves and read and work stuff out, we're not an expert. But onto that, again, within reason and with whatever you're comfortable, what are you doing now? Who are you? Do you have another job? Do you spend all your time just doing this? I mean, is this part-time? Can you just flesh that out again, whatever you're comfortable with?
Yeah, this is full-time for me. Other than this, I work as a freelancer in related to software and software programming, but this is a large focus for me as well. And I am running a blog website, so I'm going to be focusing on that full time, as well as a business on the side, an online business. So that's gonna take up my focus for now.
Okay.
But I definitely want to make an impact in terms of helping people learn about these hidden truths and different pieces of critical knowledge, which I think would have a huge impact on people's lives.
And to kind of allude to what you were saying before, you're not just sitting back there looking at television, making notes and whatnot. It seems like you're actually doing a little bit of a deep dive into credible resources in order to give weight to some of your theories. What else are you looking at? You mentioned the Lancet there. You've mentioned doing a deep dive into medical literature, for example. Where else are you getting your information?
So you have to get very creative when you sort of scour the web for information, because Google really suppresses a lot of critical search results and websites. Google is pretty much useless as a search engine. It's a very, very low quality search engine. And I usually start with DuckDuckGo as a baseline to search for information, and usually just whatever specific thing I'm looking for, whether it's a conspiracy or whatever, I'll usually get at least a starting point from there in terms of whether it's a certain blog post that was written by somebody or an obscure paper that's posted somewhere on a PDF. But you kind of have to be like a investigative, detective in terms of pulling out all those different puzzle pieces, and they might come in, various sources that you don't really expect. Um, like for example, when I was researching, Antoine Béchamp for virology and microbiology, I found an obscure French website which had a lot of details of information about him, but someone had actually created some really vivid and colorful PowerPoint presentations describing the entire, aspect of his research that was hidden and suppressed in the medical literature and in the history. Just to give a particular example. So you will find when you dig far enough, you will find things in unexpected places, and
If you
they will help you to put the pieces of the puzzle together.
if you could share that one with me, that'd be great. Because just in to give more context to what you're talking about Antoine Beauchamp, who throws up a huge question mark about how we actually think about germs and viruses in general. And he was, I guess, the arch enemy almost at the time of a fellow called Louis Pasteur. And Pasteur had all the backing of massive corporations in order to kind of perpetuate this idea about infection, whereas Beauchamp's research, from what I can see and from my digging, was very, very solid, except it just didn't fit a narrative that would have us all on being vaccinated and taking antibiotics and taking medications. Would that be what a good way of describing that?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I would even say it in a more extreme fashion. I would say that Louis Pasteur was essentially used to create an industry out of thin air, an industry that basically didn't exist and didn't need to exist and serves no practical purpose for humanity, which is the big pharma and the medical industrial complex.
So, are you throwing it down? And again, I know your work, so I'm kind of leading the question, I guess, that the majority of what big pharma are about is actually harming us.
Yes, big pharma is a for-profit business model, so they prioritize profits above all else. So even if they say on the surface that we are doing things to research, for benevolence or for good purposes, that's just a cover story. The reality is that people seem to be sicker than ever in this day and age, and we hear a lot of propaganda about how helpful big pharma has been in various aspects, but the reality is that they just churn out medications to treat symptoms without really identifying the underlying cause and addressing that. And the reason for that is because they don't want you to know what is the underlying cause, because they're in collusion with government and the essentially the international cabal that controls governments of the world. They're in collusion with them because you have different industries that are poisoning you with the food supply and the air quality and other routes of poisons. And then you have the medical industry, which essentially profits from that because people go to the medical industry for help when they're poisoned by the food supply or they're poisoned by some other mechanism that was knowingly given to them. And so it's just one vicious cycle, one vicious circle, and the average person is caught in the middle of that. And I think you have to empower yourself with the right information so that you can pull yourself out of that paradigm. Because otherwise you're just kind of a punching bag for the government and the medical industry, big pharma, etc.
It's interesting. I've got a few friends who are much older. One is 72 plus, the other is in his 80s, and they almost never go to doctors. They don't take medications, and they're the anomaly. They're really fit, and it seems to be the more tablets you're on, the sicker you are. Now, whether that means that you are sick and you need the tablets, or whether that means that you had something wrong and you took tablets and you stayed sick, I kind of throw it out there for people to work that one out themselves. Okay, so we might just start. I mean, we can go down so many different rabbit holes with just the little things that you've thrown out there, Sage. So thank you very much for bearing with me and bearing with my questions. How can people look at your work and follow you and see what you're about?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is that anonymous sage1, and feel free to also check out my website, which is sageobserver.com, where I posted blog posts about various topics, including artificial intelligence, transhumanism, cashless society, the medical industry, viruses, virology. And right now I'm doing a series where I basically uncover the fraud behind the 1918 pandemic, which was over 100 years ago, and basically the precursor, or kind of laying the foundation for what just took place with COVID. So I think that is something that could be life-changing information for people.
We didn't even talk about the cashless society, and I wanted to pick your brains about that, but we're running out of time. But so I'd probably love to get you back again and do this at a later stage, because there's a lot to cover. But listen, we'll wind it up.
Web is huge.
Absolutely. Listen, thank you very much for your time. It was a little bit hard to coordinate between the different continents and with the time zones and whatnot, but we got there in the end. So again, my gratitude, my friends. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to that you invited me on your show.
Thank you. You've been listening to Dennis from Awakening in Health, and many people might be listening to this at the start of the week, so it's really important to have a great setup for that week. Get out there with some great energy, keep your eyes open, have a look at what's going on around you, and just have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening.